Welcome to the Horse Girl Gazetteer. Join Georgia and Kate as we dive into this week's conversation. From health and fitness to communication and understanding, we are determined to develop our maps and help you to develop yours. Hi, Kate.
Hello.
Let's chat about finding the magic in everyday things.
Yeah, that sounds great.
What do you think about that? What is your experience and your professional opinion?
Yeah, so it's something I think about a lot when I think about how I want to go about having an equine business. And I think there's a lot of angles for that phrase. I think one of them is as a professional, because I think it's fairly well known that a lot of professionals in the equine business burn out and kind of lose the magic. And so I think that that's one angle to think about that idea. And then another angle is the experience of learning to ride and becoming a horse person. Because I think we all come to riding in some way for some of the magic. I think everybody maybe sees a little bit of a different flavor of magic in horses. We certainly share a lot of them. But I think that we come to riding with an idea or a vision or a picture or a story of what it means to be around horses or have a relationship with a horse. And then the reality of learning to ride includes a lot of things that maybe weren't part of that vision. And the timeline can be a bit different than what we were expecting. And some of the content of the journey with horses is, I think, a little rockier sometimes, or a little bit more challenging, or a little bit more uncomfortable than kind of the fantasy that we have in our head when we get started. So I think those are kind of two different ways to different directions, different perspectives on the idea of finding the magic in the everyday things in riding. And I guess as a rider yourself, who started as a very tiny human being and was, I think, part of your mom's lesson program and other lesson programs and is riding in a program as an adult, you have some firsthand experience around that idea throughout your life. So I think, like, to start with, do you recall as a tiny human what was the most magical to you in your experience? And I guess I don't even know. Did your mom get you into riding, or did you
Yes.
ask to get into riding?
No, my mom was like, you are going to ride horses. And as a kid, yes, I wanted to make my mom happy 100% of the time. It's how I got into horseback riding. It's how I got into hiking. If she was like, this is the thing I'm doing and I'm spending time doing this, I was all about it.
Yeah.
I have since developed my own independent love of it, which is exemplified in that her barn closed when I was 8 or 9, I think. And I got back into riding shortly after that. But probably the most magical things that I remember are just hanging out with my friend and riding. I've always really loved sharing my horses and sharing my experiences, and my best memories are with other people.
Yeah.
Like as a kid, my childhood best friend and I would go up the river on our horses. I was very blessed to have a pony and a second horse on the farm, Maverick and Lucy, when I was a child, and we lived right on a river. It was really idyllic.
Yeah.
And so my friend and I would take these horses and just disappear up the river for hours on end.
Yeah.
And it was so much fun. And I don't think I ever actually fell off on any of those rides, which is insane to me. And I feel like is a little bit of magic, just that nothing bad happened when so many bad things could have happened.
Yeah.
And it just always felt so precious and so treasured. And then recently as an adult, sharing jewels with one of my friends who is not a horse person at all has been really magical and has been a really good reminder for me of how wonderful it is to hang out with horses.
Yeah.
They'll come to the barn with me and we'll be beaming, leading him up from the paddock or bringing him back down to the paddock or brushing him or whatever. And it just always makes me feel all warm inside to see other people feeling that joy too. And then for myself also, just anytime I'm able to just be chilling with the horse. Like I remember when we had the Harmony Horsemanship Clinic here and we were all doing the like little tiny Liberty exercise.
Yeah.
One of the things that Lindsay said was, congratulations, all of your horses like you too much to really learn anything from this. We were all practicing joining up and all of our horses were just like, yeah, I want to be a part of this, which I thought it was so cool watching other people do that. And then when it happened with Jules and I, it just like filled me up with excitement and happiness. And like as a teenager, just goofing around like in a halter and lead rope, doing whatever.
Yeah.
Those little things.
So part of that sounds like as a child, it kind of started as like this kind of community togetherness with your mom was part of where the magic started.
Yeah.
Which I think is so interesting and important and makes me think a little bit about, as someone running a program and teaching lessons, about the value of group lessons. I often have people who are looking for private lessons, which, I do some of my best, most intensive teaching in a private lesson setting because it gives me opportunity to really focus and get into the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts and the stuff that's really exciting. But I do think that a focus on a private lesson does kind of rob people of the experience of sharing horses and horsemanship with other people. So there is some real value in finding ways to do horses with friends and with peers. We've got a group right now. Our kind of core group of kids are really different ages, which is interesting. We have 9, 11, 13, and 17, all girls. And it's been interesting. We had them here all week. It has been interesting watching them get along with each other and support each other, even though they're developmentally at wildly different places, all sharing this obsession with horses and finding ways to connect with each other and support each other as they're kind of doing the barn chores. And we went and watched a horse show and, we were in the car together for 4 hours. And I think that is absolutely part of the magic of horses, is that it brings together people who would not otherwise have had an opportunity to learn from each other, because it is so much, it's an obsession that is present in teeny tiny humans. And I have a lot of older adults who didn't get to ride as kids and whose own children have left and gone to college or moved on with their own lives. And now these are women who can now do something for themselves. And I think it's been fun to have a farm that encourages that and be in a program that encourages that, because there's so much that the adults learn from the joy that the smaller kids have. And there's a lot of wisdom that the younger kids learn from older adults who may be less experienced than them, but have better judgment and a different perspective on what's happening. So I think that for me is certainly a source of joy and a big piece of the magic of the horse world as a professional and also as a student myself, learning from the kids I teach, or I'm learning from women who are older and wiser than I am as well.
Yeah, I think that's been something that I've always enjoyed about like barn communities, is that chances are somebody who's twice your age and somebody who's half your age, and you're probably equally happy to chat with either one of them when you're at the barn, because they're both there for the same reason.
Yeah.
And there's like an automatic common ground that you have with anybody who walks through the door, even if it's like a parent of a kid or something like that, is that we're all around the horses. We all, for some reason, are invested in this sport.
Yeah.
Which I think automatically lends itself well to community.
Yeah.
And one thing that I was chatting with my friend about, who I was visiting this past week, was that we both remember as teenagers the things that we did that were like quote unquote the most impressive, like the largest we jumped or the fastest we ran a cross country course or something like that, came from egging each other on and like being in a group that like you kind of all push each other in a way. And I don't know if you still see this with your kids too, but like that's like very distinct memory for me as a teenager, is everyone being like, "Oh, let's jump that fence.
Yeah.
I bet you we can put it up another notch. I bet you we can put it up another notch." And sometimes under the supervision of the trainer, occasionally not. So those were less good choices, but still again, at the end of the day, it was a good way to develop some camaraderie.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, equestrian sports generally tend to be more individual, quote unquote, individual sports. Ironically, they are by definition team sports because you are in a team with your horse. But I think the kind of teamwork that evolves when there's a group of riders working together and supporting each other is somewhat unique because everybody's kind of rowing their own boat, but kind of all in the same ocean. And interesting because some people there's always someone who has experienced what you're experiencing or a flavor of what you're experiencing. And when it can be tempting to feel like you're the only one who's ever had this problem, you almost always are not. And that can be very comforting, that kind of support. The other thing that you mentioned, everybody's come to horses for some reason, which I think is an interesting thing to dig into a little bit more. Like, why do people come to horses? Like, why are we all here? And you had mentioned that in the Harmony Horsemanship Clinic, we were doing kind of a variation on join up. And in some clinics, I think that Lindsay teaches, you let the horse go and they go off and want to explore the environment and their energy is very high. And they can be very exciting because there's lots of movement. And it's like, how do you get the attention of this horse and become, she calls her clinic, become the center of your horse's universe. So how do you become that when you're at liberty and you have no tools, which could be super exciting. And it was very, very boring at our farm.
Extremely.
because every single horse was let loose, turned around, and kind of put their nose on the person, which was very cool and very exciting. And I think that maybe is for the people who stay with horses, I think that is a huge motivator, a huge source of magic is the times when your horse chooses you.
Yeah.
I think that's really powerful. And I think a lot of people are looking for that type of partnership, which takes us into a really interesting conversation about what do you do and how do you think about it when your horse doesn't choose you?
Yeah. Well, I think this is really interesting that this is where we've gotten because I have been doing over the past couple of years a lot of reconciling with how I was taught to train horses and that sort of thing. And not that I was ever taught to like bully the horse into submission, but it was very much like my mom grew up riding hunter jumpers in the 90s. Like it was the horse is going to do what you ask it to do.
Right.
Period. End of story. And as I've been working with Jules and even before Jules, like the year or two before him, I was getting more interested in like positive reinforcement and those sorts of things and playing with Liberty. And like the horse that I rode before him, Thunder, I rode bridleless and had so much fun doing that and was like amazed that I had that much control with no tools because of the different relationship. And with Jules, I have had your guidance and Lindsay's guidance in fostering that sort of relationship and in building it in that way and teaching him that we can exist together and I have his back and will help him regulate himself if he needs that and also teach him to also regulate himself on his own. Yeah. And the relationship that I have with him is just so fundamentally different than the one that I have with my pony. Like my pony will do whatever I ask him to, but he'll pin his ears about it every once in a while and let me know that he thinks I'm a dumbass. And Jules doesn't, which is also a personality difference, but I think it's also a difference if Jules knows that if he's not ready, he can kind of just communicate that and we'll work on it.
Yeah. I think it is a very different philosophy than some people have been brought up with or learned in traditional horsemanship, which let's acknowledge the history of that. Horses were a tool for a long time.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't an option, like your life and livelihood depended on the horse doing the thing that you told it to do now, not later. There wasn't really room for no as a concept. And I think we horses are benefiting more and more as time goes on from the fact that riding is now a luxury and it's the choice that we get to make. We do this very much, very intentionally. It's for fun. It's for, growth. And so we have the time and we have the knowledge to be able to give horses more choice and more opportunity to be expressive and communicative with us, which is really, I think, probably really great for horses. And it means that the purpose of horsemanship is less about building a horse that will do a job for us and more about exploring what it means to be in a relationship with another being, which is why I'm in horses. I don't need a horse to take me to the grocery store. Thank goodness. And I don't have to have horses to survive, besides that, I've chosen to be with horses and educate people about horses as my livelihood. So in that way, like lesson horses have a role in my life. It's not completely separate from, my financial existence. But I've chosen this. Like, I have done this purposefully, which is, I think, my hope is that my kind of gift to the world is helping to create spaces where relationships with horses give us a better understanding of ourselves. And for me, that's the biggest, most important kind of magic in the horse world and in being with horses and being intentional about choosing to be with horses, is that this kind of interesting duality between learning selflessness through self-awareness, and that the focus on, we talk a lot about self-care, self-control, self-mastery, that those are all kind of the seed of being able to be selfless, and that putting the horse first in your relationship actually means putting yourself first in the relationship, which is like a crazy mental place to go, which makes it fascinating. And I think also underscores some like really big ideas for healthy life.
Yes.
And to me, that's the point. That's the why. That's the purpose. That's the magic.
Yeah.
Of why I do what I do.
Yeah. And I'm interested in circling back a little bit to something that you started to get into, which is what happens when your horse doesn't choose you.
Yeah.
Because I think, and as we're talking, everybody is like, this requires a lot of emotional investment to have a good relationship with your horse and to have a good relationship with yourself as an equestrian.
Yes.
It feels really, really personal. So yeah, I'm interested what you were hinting at.
Yeah.
For what happens when your horse doesn't
choose
you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is a hard place to be, because I think so much of the story and the vision and maybe the fantasy about horsemanship and being with horses is this kind of like free and beautiful, gentle horsemanship fantasy,
galloping away in the field,
galloping through the field, into the sunset,
perfectly
in harmony with my horse. And it's so possible, but that's like part of a much bigger story and a much longer journey. And you're right, the emotional investment into that is enormous. And so it's like, how do you get there? And like, why does a horse say no? Why did they not choose you? This is a huge part of the harmony horsemanship philosophy. One of the reasons that they say no is because they're experiencing some sort of pain or discomfort with the thing that you're asking them to do to be with you, which could be physical or mental, emotional. Like they're experiencing some sort of threat either. And horses can't really separate their emotional and their physical selves. So this is like, if a horse is saying no and not choosing to be with me for whatever reason, I'm always first going to like look at their body and try to figure out if there's some sort of pain. And if I can solve that with a veterinary solution, with a management solution, with a nutrition solution, with a hoof care solution. And that means that the management of the horse's body is a means of managing them emotionally and mentally as well. And is like probably one of the biggest parts of the relationship is that management piece. And there's like, that's like 17 other podcast episodes to just get into all of that. But that's going to be the first reason that a horse is going to say no. Another reason is that they don't understand or they're confused. They can't do it. They don't understand it, or they simply don't want to. So there's a question of pain and comfort. There's a conversation about clarity and teaching, repeating, teaching, So the horse understands what you want and where they find release or where they find kind of an end to the ask. And then there's another piece about motivation. It's like, what for your particular horse and their particular personality, what motivates them, what makes them want to do something, what are they inspired by as a horse, as a species, and then as an individual, what are the things they like. And so that ends up being this whole exciting discovery piece as well. And I think it can be hard when your horse does say no. It's very easy to think, well, they just don't like me. Maybe. But open that box a little bit. There's a lot of vulnerability in being in a healthy relationship with anyone, especially with horses, because they're going to see through all of the facades and any lies that you're telling yourself. They're going to see right through. So there has to be a little bit of willingness in that moment to have the kind of courage to open that box a little bit and be like, okay, my horse isn't choosing me right now. Why? What am I right now that my horse maybe doesn't want to participate in? Have I brought my problems with me to the barn? Yes, probably yes.
In all likelihood.
Absolutely. There's not really a way to, check your feelings at the door. They live inside you. And I think we talked about this in another podcast when we talked with Osa, who is a mental health specialist and works with equestrians especially. It's like part of the work then is like, okay, well, what am I bringing through the barn doors that my horses now gets to deal with? What did I drag in from work or from home? And what do I need to do to kind of carry that in a way that doesn't burden my horse with it? How do I solve it is probably too strong of a word, but how do I address that so that it's not something that I'm putting on my horse? Because it's totally fair for you to walk into the barn with some really grouchy feelings and for the horse to say, I think not, and walk the other direction. That's really fair. I think another piece is, how do you spend time with your horse? Is every time you come to see your horse, is it really hard work? Or do you spend time with your horse where it's just fun, where it's chill, where it's relaxed? I think a piece that's hard sometimes is, how often are you satisfied with your experience with your horse? I think a lot of equestrians can sometimes tend towards type A personalities. And I think that's because we're really passionate about what we do and we really care about the horses and we want to do right by them and we want to do well and we strive for excellence. And sometimes that turns into being a little bit of a drill sergeant, either for our horses or on ourselves, even worse. And if you're always leaving the barn feeling like, well, we could have done a little bit better, or like we need to work a little bit more on that, if that's not quite good enough, and you're kind of carrying that feeling of not quite good enough, your horse isn't really going to necessarily want to be around that, because they're always going to feel that not quite enough feeling. And I don't like being around people who feel like that all the time.
No, it's really disheartening.
It's very discouraging. And so if that's the energy you're bringing into your experience every day, then, fair if your horse starts to walk away.
Yeah. I'm interested to know, because like you mentioned, the horses that you own, I think all of them are lesson horses, are used in your lesson program. How do you navigate that? How do you find the time to have that, quote, play or relaxation with them? So that way you can feel like, and it might not be for all of them, but whoever it is that you feel like you have a good solid relationship with, like, what do you do as a professional to foster that?
Yeah, I think a lot about that, because there's every maybe 70% of horse ads say at the bottom, no lesson programs, not to a lesson program. And I take a little bit of offense at that, knowing full well that there are many lesson programs with lesson horses that are burnt out, overused, miserable, unhappy creatures. And knowing that not every horse is cut out for a lesson program. Absolutely. I've had horses that I brought into the program who have been okay for a little while, maybe, and then make it really clear that this is not the job for them. And I have done my best to honor that and find them a better home, a better placement, which is kind of circles back to the idea of the forever horse that I think we talked about in a different episode as well. That I feel really obligated to make sure that the horses that come into my life stay in a situation that serves them and not necessarily me. If it can serve both, that's wonderful. But I've had several horses who have needed to move along because they didn't want to be lesson horses, and I accepted that. The ones who have been successful as lesson horses, how do I keep them happy? How do I keep them sound? I think a couple of different things. One, I don't really believe in the idea of a ring sour horse. I think if your horse is ring sour, then your routine or your training philosophy, your training system might not be serving the horse in the way that you intend it to. Because I think, my philosophy at least is that everything I'm doing should be building the horse's confidence and comfort. Full stop.
Right.
Part of that is through the harmony horsemanship system on the ground, which is understanding kind of the psychology of the horse and the sociology of the horse, which we don't always think about, but very much about how do horses communicate and relate with each other, and how can I step into that language, understand what they're saying to me, and then communicate with them physically in space in a way that's understandable to them. And instead of expecting them to try to learn English, I'm going to try to learn as much horse as I can. I think that contributes a lot to their comfort if they're working with somebody primarily who understands them. I think that gives them a huge sense of security and confidence. I consider myself as kind of a third part of the relationship between a lesson student and their lesson horse. And I end up being in this kind of like translator role where I'm translating for the horse what the student intends, even if they aren't clear yet themselves. And I'm translating for the student what the horse is trying to say. And I think that means that I'm not putting my horses into a situation where they're expected to have a novice rider as their primary leader. That would be like, me sending someone out on an expedition into the wilderness with, a 10-year-old as the expedition leader. I love the kids, but I'm probably not following any of them out into the wilderness.
Not gonna end well.
My chances of survival decrease. And I think that sounds dramatic, but I think the little bit the horses, they don't have the cognition that we do in that way. They think in terms of survival, and that's a little bit what it feels like. If they feel like they have a rider who is, a child who is still learning, and there are some children who are, have had excellent instruction and have great intuition, have great experience, and are absolutely able to be excellent leaders for the horses. But I'm going to try to make sure that I don't put my horses in a situation where the child is overfaced in that leadership role. So my horses always know that they're safe. And if something goes wrong, they come and stand in front of me, which sometimes is very irritating to the children, but I don't mind it. I want my horses to know that they can always come and be like, it's not going well up here. Could you help? And then we can have a conversation about that. And that becomes a learning opportunity for the child. Well, the horse came in because there was a lack of clarity. So what do we need to do? How do we need to organize your body? How do we need to change your ask so that you can give the horse the clarity that they need to follow through on whatever your plan was? So that's one way. And then I think the second big way, well, there's two more, I think, that are important. The second is just dressage as a concept. And when I say dressage, I'm not thinking of it as the competitive discipline, although that's lovely and wonderful. I'm thinking about dressage as the kind of original French origin of the word training, and the classical approach to developing a horse into its optimal performance, maintaining its soundness currently as a creature that can carry a rider as opposed to kind of propel itself forward, and one that will continue being sound for the long term. I think a lot of miserable lesson horses are lame in one way or another. And I think as a beginner rider, and this is like maybe another part of the conversation, poor riding makes horses unsound, right? Yep. And that is not something that we can pretend is not true. Learning to ride is hard on the horses. So I'm pretty picky about not letting students progress until they can do so in a balance that is going to do the least damage to the horses. Which means sometimes we put progress after the horse's well-being. And I think most of the kids love the ponies and don't disagree with that when they understand, although I do get some complaints and a lot of when can I canter. And another piece of that is that, as a trainer, part of my role is to school the horses in between rides as much as I can so that they are stronger and sounder and more prepared for their job. And then I think the last piece of that is knowing that being ridden, especially by novice riders, is hard on the horses physically and emotionally because there's a lot of inconsistency, is to make sure that I do as much veterinary support, nutrition support as I can to keep them sound and comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that my track record for accidents is particularly low, in part because I tend to be conservative, maybe overly conservative. And I go out of my way to make sure the horses are not in pain. They're not going to start bucking because they've, have a lameness they can't handle anymore. We really minimize the risk of accident and injury by keeping the horses really sound and really comfortable. And if I can't, financially or logistically do what it takes to make a horse as comfortable as they need to be for their job, that puts some limitation on them, what they can do in their lesson. And that's a choice that I am willing to make for the horses and willing to have that conversation with students. This horse can't do that thing that you'd like to know how to do because it can't do that comfortably, which means it can't do it safely.
Yeah.
So that I keep that kind of first and foremost in my program as well.
One thing you said was maybe overcautious, but to validate that a little bit too, I mentioned Twix, who is the schoolmaster who I rode in a previous episode, and her mom, who's like my dressage TM trainer for a while. And one of the things that I mentioned was I wasn't allowed to try something until I could do it.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what the context was, but there was one time where I was told, I haven't had a student fall off on me so far. Don't be the first one. And like, it was half a joke, but it was also really reassuring.
Yeah.
Because when you know that your trainer is taking the time and the effort to make sure their horse is comfortable, it means a lot. And to know they haven't lost a rider, which is like kind of insane, but like cool. It's really cool. It is a confidence booster.
Yeah.
And it took so long for me to be allowed to tack Twix up. And I was not allowed to do her leg wraps ever because there was a particular way that they would be done. And there was a particular way that everything would be set up for her because she was a schoolmaster who was pushing 20 when I started riding and older than that when I moved on with Navicular, who was doing Grand Prix dressage with her owner and was like comfortable and happy because they had found a care regimen that worked for her and were keeping her super sound. And her thing was she couldn't jump. Dressage was what she was going to do because that was where she was comfortable. And it created a lot of magic because it meant that she was really physically fit. And I think that was part of what was so fun for me about riding her and fun about schoolmasters in general. It's just that when you ask correctly, you get exactly the correct answer. And it is incredible and makes you feel like you could actually do it. And then you get on a horse that's not as good and you're like, oh, darn it, it's hard again.
Totally. Yeah, I think that is really interesting. And it's the other side of that coin is that we are all learners and we are all in progress. And there is no perfection, only the pursuit.
Correct.
And we are all, whether we want to admit it or not, living in that kind of messy middle. And being able to give ourselves permission to live in the messy middle and to be able to, as we were talking about earlier, be able to be enough and to be good enough in the moment for what we are doing can be so hard, especially when we know we have this obligation to ride better for our horses, to ride well enough for them to be sound. It can be really hard to make that progress if we're afraid to try and mess it up. And that's like a huge catch-22 in riding, one that I struggle with myself, trying to kind of feel your way forward and do as little harm as possible, but also not get stuck making no progress towards being that better rider because you're afraid to make a mistake or you feel you're not good enough yet. And I think having a trainer, having a coach, having a mentor to help kind of walk through that messy middle is so important and so helpful. That's made a huge difference in my own riding and my training. And I think by proxy, my students, is finding instructors that serve that purpose for me. That has been a really big deal, to find people who have the same philosophy as I do and can coach me in my own process has been a really, really big deal. And being able to trust the process enough and to be committed to a particular way of thinking and a particular process and a particular philosophy, so that I can know that what I'm doing, if done thoughtfully with the best intentions, is good enough. Even if it's not ever going to be perfect, it is in fact good enough. And that is really tricky. That is really, really tricky.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, that's something that I have like been directly combating with Jules since I started riding him.
Right.
And one of the things, well, you've said a couple of things to me that have been exceptionally helpful, but one of them was, if this horse needs a perfect rider, he's out of luck.
Yeah.
Like, that just doesn't exist and it's not going to happen.
Right.
And it's okay if it's a little messy.
Yeah.
And the other one was, Jules is kind of a return to like serious riding TM and training for me. Not that it's that serious, but I was really scared of him spooking on me for a while. And you said to me at one point, you're like, well, do you know how to trot and canter? Because that's all it is. Yeah. And I think that it's really easy when you're in the messy middle and it feels so messy for it to feel like so overwhelming. And for me, I do forget that I've done all of these things before. Yeah. Like I do actually know how to ride a horse. Right. And it doesn't need to be, like you said, it doesn't need to be perfect.
No. Yeah, part of relationship is learning to live with all of our little quirks and oddities and idiosyncrasies. And the reality is that we learn our horses' quirks and idiosyncrasies, and they also learn ours. Mm-hmm. And I think we could do a whole episode on the word harmony as a concept, because it's just a really fascinating word. If you're someone who is musical or has like read music, played music, the idea of harmony is not sameness. It's not two instruments playing the same thing at the same time, or two voices singing the same thing at the same time. It's two different melodies played together to create harmony. So it's two different things that mesh into something that is more beautiful than either line of music would have been independently, which is such a powerful concept when you think about your horse, right? It's not, we think about become one with the horse. We're not trying to become the horse. We're actually creating something that is kind of bigger, more beautiful, more extraordinary by matching ourselves with our horse in doing two different things that go together, which I think is a very cool idea. And it has an element of kind of energy and intention and thought and emotion. And, you know, an area that I find particularly interesting is like the physics and the mechanics of what does that look like? What is the physical interface between the horse and rider look like? How does it work? Like, how do the pieces work? What is tensegrity? What does it mean in the horse? What does it mean in the rider? And how do we put them together so that they can operate as a unit and create harmony?
Yeah. So Maverick, who's honestly the most bold pony I've ever encountered. Like, he is bold and he is forward and he'll jump anything you point him at. I mean, he's 25 now. He's kind of done jumping things, but he would jump anything you pointed him at. Yeah. He'd bomb down any trail. And I have always been a little bit more of a cautious rider. Yeah. Believe it or not, based on some of my stories. I've always had a little bit of that like anxiety, the like, oh boy, in me. And like Maverick and I have gotten into the most shenanigans because I feel like we've really found the harmony together in like, he is like bold and forward and he's like, I've got this. Like, chill out. I have got this. Yeah. Which when you can get there, which for him and I took, I mean, we've now known each other for 20 years. Like, we've known each other our whole lives. But once you get there, like the harmony it's so cool. Like anytime I took a bad fall off of a horse or just got nervous for whatever reason, I would just go back to Maverick and get back on him and be like, oh, right. It is really cool once you get through it.
Yeah. What were the pieces of that evolution when you were learning to ride Maverick? Because if I remember right, he was in training as you were also in training, which can be a recipe for heartache and disaster, but ended in the best of ways for you.
Yeah.
The things that I would use to develop harmony would be the biomechanics piece, would be the horse psychology piece. And as a very young person, you're not necessarily thinking in that analytical way. No. So I'm curious, like in your experience, what were the pieces, like looking back, what made that happen?
So Maverick was bought from way up north Maine, sight unseen, off of one picture of him standing in a mud pit in like halfway through the shedding season for $500. He came to us broke to drive, but not broke to ride. And everyone said to my mom, what are you doing? Like his picture looked ugly and he was 4 years old and uncut. And my mom was like, no, he's going to be great. I have a good feeling about this, which does not historically always work out, but in this case it really did. And she told the person who was bringing him down, said, if he gets here and he's anything other than what you've said, which we had been told he's great, sweet as a kitten, perfect little pony. She's like, if he's not that, I'm sending him home with you. And it was like a 6-hour trailer ride. So it was a commitment. So I think this woman also knew that she had to sell him when she got there. So she got there, took down the trailer, turned him around, and I was there. I was 4 years old at the time. He was also 4 years old. And she goes, is this your pony? And it was not, but I said yes. And she goes, okay. And she handed me the lead rope of this 4-year-old uncut stud pony. And he did. He followed me off the trailer, sweet as a freaking kitten, and was extremely polite and was always a very sweet boy. And then I was just like enamored. I was like, oh my God, I love this pony. And one of my mom's lesson students also fell in love with this pony. And we were like, we would like to show Maverick. And mom went, darn it. Because she was planning to breed him to her like best lesson pony at the time and create another beautiful lesson pony, which was not meant to be because they don't let 4 and 5-year-olds show uncut studs. It's not really how that works. I mean, like, I don't remember a ton of the details because, again, I was training him when I was like 5.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of her other lesson student who was doing a lot of the training too, because she was probably like closer to like 11 or 12 and had been riding for several years. So it was like pretty solid. It was just a lot of following my mom's guidance. And the times I didn't listen to her, there were the times that things went wrong. I have at least one concussion to blame on not listening to my mother and making a dumb choice.
Yep.
But I think for me, a lot of it was being kind of bold as a kid and like not really, that prefrontal cortex wasn't developed. I didn't know that I was going to get hurt really badly if I did something dumb.
Yeah.
And also I just had so much time. And my mom was always one to, in the times when it was safe, let us just figure it out. Like for his first show, or maybe it wasn't his first show, but one of the earlier ones, she had shown me how to sew braids a few times. And then she was like, all right, show's tomorrow. Your horse is bathed. I'm going to go inside. You and her lesson student do sewn braids. And they have to be done by the morning because that's when we're leaving for the show. And there were a lot of hours spent in that barn trying to remember how to do that and trying to figure it out again. I think that's what did it for Maverick and I, is that there was a lot of learning happening at the same time. And the times that it was safe to, my mom really just let us figure it out together.
Yeah.
When I came back to him as like a 10, 11-year-old, it was like, I just wanted to get into shenanigans. And he was also 10 and 11. So he was like kind of in the peak of his physical fitness. And I was like, you want to go bomb down a trail and fly over a log that I haven't scouted yet? And he was like, yeah, absolutely. I want to do that.
I think that is a challenge thinking about my students. There aren't a lot of opportunities for them to spend quite as much time with the horses.
And I think that's something that Denny Emerson, honestly, I've seen a lot of his posts about. It's just like kids don't have the same opportunities and the same access to trails. Even.
Yeah. I have found students to be a lot less bold and a lot less resilient to challenges, mistakes, falls. Their confidence gets pretty dent up pretty easily, it seems, more so than I remember as a kid. And the amount of supervision that is necessary and the amount of support that they need make it pretty challenging to give them just hours.
Yeah.
The hours that they would need to develop in the same way that you did, I think. Obviously, you had the advantage of growing up
I
with full access to horses.
Absolutely will recognize that was I grew up extremely privileged in that regard. Like,
yeah,
that the unfettered access to the horses was
that
insane.
is that's a big plus. But I think there's a lot of confidence that you gained, not necessarily from saddle time, but just like I'm sure you had to do chores.
Oh yeah.
And muck out and watch the horses and just be around the horses in a way that's really different from a student who comes for an hour, tacks up, rides, gets off in an hour, goes home, comes back next week.
Yep.
That's a much less immersive situation for a young rider. I think, again, another topic for another episode is finding ways to give kids more access to that, because I suspect that a lot of what looks like not quite as much boldness or not quite as much confidence or less resilience is also due to less access.
Yeah. Yeah, it's harder to bounce back after a fall if you're not there the next day cleaning that horse's stall.
Right. I mean, you had a daily relationship with your horse.
Mm-hmm.
That someone who's there once a week is not going to have quite the same, ultimately is going to have a relationship with the horse, and a valuable, meaningful, important one, but not going to be quite the same a relationship that you would have being there every day. I think my childhood experience, I was at the barn probably twice a week, and I did a lot of chores when I was there on the weekends, but I had my weekly lesson. I worked for a second lesson, and certainly felt really connected with the horses that I rode. I was able to ride a consistent horse for months and months and develop a relationship with them. So I don't know that it's 100% required to have that kind of daily interaction with horses.
No, like I don't think it's something that I have now. Like I'm not here every day.
No.
But like I mentioned earlier, like my relationship with Jules is amazing.
Yeah.
Like for me now,
yeah,
I guess is the experience I can speak to. I always come in with the intention to be here for whatever the day is going to be.
Yeah.
I try not to come in with a lot of expectations, which is partially because I'm working through like my own anxiety about it, and also he's 4, but also just because I am trying to find those little pieces of magic that are like come from just like hanging out.
Yeah.
Like the other day I was here and I gave him a bath, and then I just like sat on the rocks and let him graze for a little bit. And I was like, wow, this is so much fun. And he came over and he was like, Mom, I have a bug on my shoulder. Help. And like, that was just, it was adorable. And it was so sweet.
Yeah.
So I think you need to be a little bit more intentional about building those relationships and finding those little nuggets of meaning and magic.
Right.
But I think it's absolutely still possible.
Yeah. We talked a little bit at the beginning about how one perspective on this idea of finding the magic on everyday things has to do with being a rider who comes to horses for a story and a vision and this kind of maybe sometimes a fantasy of what it's going to be like to be with horses. And that's really powerful and important and meaningful. But we then get into the kind of the reality of the day-to-day life with horses, which is a lot of hard work. It's like an emotional investment. It's a physical investment. We haven't really talked about fitness as an issue, but that's again another whole podcast about the importance of physical fitness for riding, and that reality of riding doesn't always look like the story and the picture that you had in your head when you came to horses. But I think what we've been talking about is all of these little things that are that magic, and we discover that the magic isn't in the end where we're galloping along bareback and bridleless into the future, but that the magic is in the care we give to ourselves, the things we learn about ourselves, the strength that we gain, the confidence, and in the people that we surround ourselves with and the community that we're a part of. And that's really where the magic of horses lives. And I think that is true as a professional as well. It's, I think, fairly well known that existing as a horse professional is a pretty big challenge. Everything is expensive. What we can charge our clients is often barely enough to cover the expenses. And most of us do it because we have this passion and this love of the horse and the love for what the relationship with a horse does for people. And I think most professionals wish they could do it for free because it's something that's so important to us, but that doesn't work because to do right by the horse, we have to pay their vet bills and we want to buy them the supplements that they need to be successful. And that's part of the whole philosophy. And that can be really discouraging to know that there's so much more we could do for the horses if only we could afford it. I think that a lot of professionals end up burning out because that is such a huge challenge. So we bought this farm 3 years ago, and that's been a huge amount of work and some really big shifts in how I think about what I do and trying to reframe the logistics of how to do what I want. How do I kind of serve my passion and how do I serve my clients in this space, which has involved a lot of big decisions and a lot of choices and some compromises and some, having to cut things out that aren't serving the purpose or aren't feasible. And I've been more intentional in that process than I have in the past about making sure that what I'm doing does continue to kind of fill my own cup personally, and that I do take the time to find kind of my own magic in this situation and in this space. And I think there's some pressure as a professional to kind of be out in the world and to be seen as successful. And what that looks like is maybe, being on the show circuit, winning, or at least scoring well, getting accolades and credentials in that way. And I think that financially is not feasible for a lot of people. And if that's how you are recording success for yourself and where you're trying to find success, that can be, especially when it's a huge financial investment to make any of that possible in a way that's good for the horse, that can be really, really frustrating. I think a lot of people burn out on that path. So like I said, I've gone out of my way to have those goals as well in my head, but also to find where is it that I am having success in the small things. So I often take my pony out bareback into the woods and just wander off. And part of that is a mindfulness, right? To get myself out of kind of the spinning, kind of what's the next emergency? What's the next thing I need to do to be marketing myself, to be, bringing in new clients, to be trying to keep the business afloat, to pay the next bill, to get in the next load of hay, learning the next thing. Get myself out of that spiral and into the present moment, and notice that we're going to have a lot of blackberries this year because all the blackberry bushes are almost falling over because they have so many flowers on them. And we've got these really cute little purple irises growing in the stream by the swamp this year. And the water's a little lower than it was last year at this time. And then that wet spot in the field back there, that's interesting. And listening to the birds and just appreciating this place that is mine, and remembering to be so grateful to all of the time and education and hard choices that I have made that have got me to this point. Even the struggles and the heartbreak and the tears and the tears and the tears, the occasional blood, like just, the fair amount of struggle that's gone into creating this place where I can do and I can have the pieces that are really essential to my vision, which is, to be able to have the option to get on my pony, to know that I have the physical strength and I have the skill and the balance to know that I can be on her bareback alone in the woods and be about as safe as I can be. The training that's gone into that, the time just spent with her, which that's a whole nother story of struggle as well, is getting to know this pony and trying to let go to, face kind of my own tendencies and overcome them, to be able to have a healthy relationship with this pony, to have the support, the people who have been a part of making it possible for me to have this farm in the first place, who continue to support it, who help me with the chores, who help keep it afloat, and who make it, worth getting up every morning and continuing to do this. I really appreciate those little moments. And if I could give my younger self advice, it would be to prioritize that more from the beginning, because you can't pour from an empty cup. And even though it doesn't necessarily feel like the 40 minutes wandering out around the farm doesn't feel like necessarily progress as far as paying a bill or fixing a whatever that needs to be fixed, those things are never going to go away. And it's absolutely worth taking the time to do the little things that kind of keep the magic alive for you, and to be in the present in what you already have, instead of trying to live in the future where you have more than what you have now, because none of that is guaranteed. And the magic doesn't live in the future. It lives in right now.
Right. Yeah. If we're looking away from the future, one thing for me in the present to keep myself aware of that magic is thinking about how excited 10-year-old Georgia would be if she got a peek into the future and saw exactly what we're doing. Like if 10-year-old Georgia saw that 24-year-old Georgia was going to be making a Horse Girl podcast, she would lose her mind as soon as she figured out what a podcast was. What do you think 10-year-old Kate would think if she could see you?
Well, it's very funny because I think the writing was almost literally on the wall, because I think about 98% of my creative writing in 3rd and 4th grade was horse themed. And I think there's an entire collection in the basement right now of acrostic poetry based on horse words. And if I can find it, I may share it at some point. And I think that it is accompanied by, though I haven't been able to put my hands on it recently, a short story about a little girl who lived with her white horse in a cottage on the edge of the meadow. And while I believe it is extremely cringy, I do believe I have manifested that.
Absolutely. I love that so much. Well, here's to continuing to find the magic in everyday things and make our lives cool enough that our 10-year-old selves would think they were cool.
Indeed. I think we already have.
I think so too. That's all for now. Talk to you later. Thanks for joining us this week at the Horse Girl Gazetteer. You can find us online at Horse Girl Gazetteer on Facebook or Instagram, and you can listen wherever you find your podcasts. You can also email us questions or comments at horsegirlgazetteer@gmail.com. Georgia can be found at Equine Virtual Assistant on Instagram and Facebook, and Kate can be found at Hideaway Acres on Facebook and Hideaway Acres Horse Farm on Instagram. If you found yourself enjoying our content, please leave a review to help others find their way to us. We appreciate any and all support. Talk to you later.